Now, we continue to bring you the latest on what's happening nationwide in the fight to occupy Wall Street, but which has grown so much from coast to coast. The movement is gaining momentum. It originated in New York, but it spread, as you can see behind me, to Los Angeles, Boston, Chicago, and cities in between like Boise, Idaho, Tampa, Florida, and Portland, Oregon are joining in too. We have crews in both LA and New York. We'll continue to bring you coverage. And speaking of the Big Apple, let's go to our New York studio where we're joined by Arun Gupta, head of the Indypendent newspaper. Thank you for being on the show because you have been covering this and you think this is going to be big. Why do you think this has the nucleus, as you put it, of a revolt?
Well, it's remarkable what's been accomplished already. It started the first week with just maybe about 100 people sleeping out at night. And then you go down there every day at this point. There are thousands of people. There's media from around the world. You have prominent people coming by every day. I ran into Jeffrey Sachs today. Joseph Stiglitz has just been down there. Naomi Klein. Susan Sarandon, Michael Moore, Cornel West, on and on and on. There's a feeling that there's something dramatic and very important happening here. The political system is having to respond. Obama has had to acknowledge that the protesters have legitimate demands. The city of New York, which normally does not tolerate any sort of public protest of this sort, it tries to very much pen it in and to constrain it and contain it, has been unable to shut it down despite a series of aggressive police responses the last 2 weekends. You've seen the mainstream media, such as many of the big papers and publications, they've been covering it, and first they started ridiculing it, and some of the reporters who've been ridiculing it, such as the New York Times' Gina Bellafante and Andrew Ross Sorkin, a week later they start writing sympathetic pieces to it. That's because it's clear and a large majority of the general public sympathizes and supports the protesters. They tapped into something very real, which is that there's extreme disparities of wealth and power in this country, that there's a 1% that essentially rules America, and the vast majority of the population is left without power and many without even the basic means of survival.
And Arun, I hear what you're saying, but on the other side of that, you know, you mentioned that the mainstream media has had to cover this now and that you feel like they're being more sympathetic. But for every one of those reports, I bet I could show you one that is dismissive or that barely touches upon what these protesters are calling for or that downplays really what is going on there. It's certainly a far cry from what you described as far as how momentous this feels. Do you think that that is going to hurt the impact of this movement?
Well, sure, of course. I mean, you know, there's a famous quote by Mahatma Gandhi where he says, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they attack you, and then you win. Social change does not happen overnight. It's a process of very hard social and political struggle. There are many people who have vested interest, great vested interest in the status quo, and they are not going to give that power or wealth up without this horrific fight. But you get a sense that the state, that the elite, the financial power, the political players are all on the defensive. And this is a long way from any sort of revolution. You know, that's why I was very careful to say this is the nucleus of a revolt that could. It hasn't changed anything, but it could change things. And we're starting to see these first transformations in public consciousness, in how people imagine themselves, imagine their ability to change the world, to act in the world. And we're starting to see that reflected a little sympathetically in the media. So, you know, I don't want to say it's completely black or white.
Right, of course. And along those lines, you mentioned that President Obama has acknowledged why protesters are out there. We saw Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke say he can't blame them for protesting over, you know, the joblessness and the economic problems in this country. But there's protests, and then there's protests turning into power and channeling that to create change. So what do you think these protests can really accomplish ultimately?
Well, I mean, for one, you can see that politicians may try to, on their own, give concessions. For instance, that they will scale back the austerity cuts, that they will not be so fervent in trying to undermine Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and other social support programs. That they sense that there is so much anger out there, and it's now starting to get organized, especially when you have these occupations across the country. You can't just throw the vast majority of the population into deprivation and not expect a social explosion. So, of course, they will try to buy off the public. Now, the question comes, can these protest movements institutionalize their power? Can they reproduce their power? How would that look like? Does that mean another political party? Does that mean some sort of large social movement? It's not clear at this point. These protests and occupations are very inchoate. They're very unformed.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a risk of, because it's unformed and inchoate, do you think there could be a risk of all of this momentum getting diffused and not ever amounting to anything? Or do you think that would be impossible at this point?
It could potentially get diffused. That is a distinct possibility. That it does fade away, and people will be like, what was that all about? But at the same time, I don't think so, because if we look at, say, the anti-globalization movement of about a decade ago, it at least in the U.S., it did collapse after September 11th, but it did very much have an effect in terms of it marginalized the IMF and its role in terms of transferring money from third world countries to Western-based banks. And even though you didn't have a big protest movement anymore, at least in the U.S. and much of Europe, there was still an impact. There were still protest movements, and a lot of countries were emboldened and able to get out of the IMF debt trap. So, it's like, we can't predict the future, but I think it will have a positive effect.
And just quickly, I'm almost out of time. I need a quick answer. But if you had to compare, because in your story, you mentioned the strikes of the 1930s in the U.S. You mentioned the lunch counter sit-ins in the 1960s. You also mentioned the uprisings we've seen in the Arab Spring. If you had to compare this to one thing we've seen in history so far, what would it be?
I think clearly the anti-globalization movement, because this is the child of the anti-globalization movement. That named global capitalism as the problem, the system that needs to be changed, and it's still the system. It's always gotten more powerful and destructive in the last decade.
All right, there you have it. Capitalism, the core problem that you say people are out in the streets up in arms over. Thank you for being on the show. That was Arun Gupta, head of the Indypendent newspaper.
Thanks for having me.